Hello, hello, and welcome to NextGen Industrialists podcast. Today we have a special guest. We are going to be talking about the journey through the hidden world of global supply chains. Peter S. Goodman, a renowned expert and author of the book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. He is joining us today to shed light on the fascinating yet fragile networks that bring products and services to our doorsteps. As the COVID-19 pandemic revealed, our global supply chains are more vulnerable than we ever imagined, even 4 years after the fact. From running out of infant formula and toilet paper to facing critical shortages of semiconductor chips, these disruptions have impacted our lives and continue to impact our lives in profound ways. Peter's book delves into the reasons behind these shortages and what we can do to build more resilient systems for the future. So stay with us as we explore the intricacies of global logistics, the business decisions that have shaped our supply chains, and the lessons we must learn to safeguard against a future crisis. Let us dive in. Peter, welcome to NextGen Industrialists podcasts.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, great. So we're going to get right into this. I'm really curious to know, at what point did you decide to write this book, and what inspired you to write How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain?
Well, it was really quite personal. I never imagined that I would write a book about the global supply chain, which is a subject that's always been part of other subjects I've written about in the course of writing about the global economy for now, I don't know, 25 or even 30 years. But I was living in London with my family. I was based there for the New York Times, European economic correspondent. And I was finishing up my last book, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, which is about the rise of right-wing populism and the commonality from Brexit to Trump to the rise of the right in Sweden and Italy and France being economic inequality. And then the pandemic happened. And we had a baby born, our third child, our son, on April 8th of 2020. And my wife was quite stoic about the fact that her parents couldn't fly in from New York to help with the baby, and I could only be in the hospital for an hour, given quarantines and lockdowns. And after we got out of the hospital and got home with the baby, she understood that government offices were closed. He basically didn't exist on paper. We couldn't take him to the pediatrician's office. But where I remember she really broke down was when we tried to order hand sanitizer. And we couldn't find any anywhere in London on any e-commerce sites. I went around the neighborhood, couldn't even find the ingredients to make hand sanitizer. We couldn't find face masks. And of course, we discovered that everybody we knew was experiencing a similar disappearance of things we had just taken for granted. I mean, we ran out of toilet paper, to your point. We didn't actually run out of toilet paper. People hoarded toilet paper, but it was the same thing. We couldn't find it. And my wife turned to me at one point and said, well, you're supposed to understand the global economy. What's going on? And I realized that I didn't fully understand it. And more than that, it was so bewildering because here's this part of commercial life, of modern life, that we really don't think about very much. I mean, sort of like flipping on the light switch, you don't think about the electrical grid and what energy is being burned. You just flip it on, the lights come on. Well, if the lights don't come on in a really dark time, you do start to think about what's going on and how vulnerable are we. So I started to write stories about the supply chain. I started to write stories about the shipping crisis, shortages of containers in China, incredible spikes in the prices of moving goods around the globe. And I kind of quickly discovered I'm not going to get a satisfying answer to the question of really what is going on without a book length treatment. So I started diving in to look at the roots of the kind of China-centric form of globalization that has been dominant in most of our lifetimes. The roots of mass assembly. I started to look at labor markets and quickly figured out this merits a book.
No, I mean, that's really incredible. You actually tell this story in your book about your wife giving birth and having to even delay the birth certificate because there weren't government officials to actually provide
Yeah.
this level of service at that time. And you begin the book by saying the world has fallen apart.
Yeah, my
And
wife
then
said
you
that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you go into how does the wealthiest country on earth run out of protective gear in the middle of a public health catastrophe? How do its parents find themselves unable to locate crucially needed infant formula? How do its largest companies spend billions of dollars making cars that no one can drive for a lack of chips? And what led you to Hagen Walker? Hagen Walker, I believe, was a manufacturer here in the US, a small business
Yeah.
who produced a specific product for Sesame Street, if I recall. And so when you talk about getting into the roots of trying to figure out what really happened with global supply chains, you mentioned you pretty much highlight his story from why he decided to produce his goods in China and what he had to go through especially during the pandemic, because that was at the inflection point that he made the choice to go to China to manufacture his products. Can you go a little bit into that and how you guys two connected?
Yeah, well, so I knew as I started writing this book that there were discrete areas of the global economy that I was really interested in. I wanted to understand the rise of mass assembly combined with the emergence of the container ship and international trade deals like the one that brought China into the World Trade Organization to explain, why are we so dependent upon this one country on the other side of the Pacific Ocean for so many critical goods. And then I wanted to understand the disruption of the pandemic itself, what happens when you can't operate your factory at full capacity. Excuse me. And then finally, I wanted to understand the various transportation networks that we're dependent on to get our goods from factories to where we need them. Most immediately the international shipping industry, but I also want to understand domestically railroads, history of deregulation, trucking, the dock workers. But rather than just sort of write chapters on each aspect of this, which I thought would be uninviting to the reader, I wanted a compelling narrative. So I thought the best way to do that would be to find either one company I could look at if it was a larger company that had operations around the globe and sort of see how all of these pieces of the company work together. Or the idea that I liked the most and that I eventually settled on was find one shipment of goods and follow it from a factory in China across the Pacific to one of these giant floating traffic jams that I think a lot of us remember, 50, 60, 70 container ships floating off the twin ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. These are the two ports in Southern California that are the gateway to about 40% of all imported goods reaching the United States by container ship. And then look at trucking and rail and so on. And so, like most reporters, I get a lot of emails from PR people that I mostly disregard, to be quite honest, because it's usually some version of, thank you so much for writing this story that you wrote about this one company. How about you write the same story with my client as and so usually I archive those and forget about them. I started to respond to some of these pitches. Anything that touched on the supply chain, I would say, no, I don't want to write about how your app is revolutionizing commerce as we know it. But I am really interested in speaking to a company if they will open up to me that
Mhm.
will share the particulars of this journey from a factory town in China to some end warehouse in the United States. And eventually, I got hooked up with this company called Freightos, which is sort of like Expedia for container shipping for companies that are small enough that they don't have contracts with ocean carriers. You know, a company like Amazon is moving thousands of containers around the world per week. Well, Hagen Walker, the guy that Freightos introduced me to, is running a startup company in his college town of Starkville, Mississippi. He graduated from Mississippi State with a degree in engineering, stayed in town to produce these light up novelty cubes. These plastic cubes, you drop them in water, they light up. His original market was bars. Bartenders could drop a light up cube in a drink. It was kind of a fun thing that would happen. They could glance down the bar and see immediately who needed a refill because the light went off. And then somebody wrote to him and said, you know, my child has autism, and bath time is an absolute nightmare because the sound of rushing water is very overwhelming. And then we dropped one of your cubes in the bath, and it really seemed to ease our child. Well, this became this idea for these bath toys. And I met Hagen Walker shortly after he signed the most important deal in the history of his startup to make these light up glow cubes, Elmo themed, for Sesame Street. And it just so happened that I was following the first order of his that was big enough to actually justify its own 40-foot shipping container from Ningbo, this industrial city in China, across the Pacific. And Hagen, the minute I talked to him, was clearly this very engaging, open, young guy, curious about what had happened himself. I mean, he's no expert in international shipping, though he knew more about it than I did at that point. And he was willing to let me fly down to Mississippi, sit by his side, look through, you know, reams of emails and documents to sort of piece together this harrowing journey where he barely made it in time for the holiday season of 2021 with the most important order in the history of his company.
No, it's a fascinating tale, actually. The value of China's exports multiplied from 272 billion in 2001, the year it actually officially joined, the World Trade Organization, to more than 3.5 trillion 20 years later. Why is it that everyone all of a sudden decided to offshore our manufacturing here in the US and also globally, right? It just wasn't the US. Like, what was it about China that was so attractive?
Yeah, you know, China presented an unbeatable combination of scale, logistics capacity, uh, had really concentrated, targeted investments in things like basic education for workers so that people had literacy and skills to go work in a factory. And then the infrastructure, ports, highways, the electrical grid, and then entered the WTO in 2001 as a way to attract more foreign investment into industry. And at the same time, on our side of the Pacific, our own economy became marinated in the mantra that it was just all about making share prices go up. And the heads of publicly traded companies perpetually on the prowl for ways to cut their costs, to get out from under unions, to find a haven where they could, you know, bypass workplace safety and environmental standards by cutting in Communist Party official. You know, China beckoned as the ultimate solution to their problems, and you know, this is not by accident. I mean, I tell the story of how the Clinton administration was lobbied heavily by retailers, American manufacturers, to get China into the World Trade Organization as a way to crack China open to investment. And ultimately, what we got was, you know, what I'd consider to be the most ironic and momentous a joint venture in the history of global capitalism between Walmart and the People's Republic of China. This institution forged in a peasant-led rebellion in the name of Marxism becomes the perfect joint venture partner for the world's largest retailer from the citadel of capitalism, the United States. And it was very profitable for Walmart shareholders. It was a consumer bonanza for Americans. It was very costly to the couple of million American workers who lost their jobs in the decade after China entered the WTO, and Americans, we really failed to cushion the blow for people who got left behind and really abandoned. But it became the path of least resistance. So Hagen Walker, by the time he's got his startup idea, 20 years plus, 20 years after China enters the WTO, he's intent on actually making his product in the United States. He's committed to his local community, but he just can't find people who can make what he needs. At one point, he tries to get somebody to make the packaging for his light up, his bath toys. He wants like a children's book style pop-up book with etching. And he calls around, and one factory says, look, this is just too complicated. You just get this made in China. And if that's what everyone else is doing, then that's where the supply chain gravitates, the raw materials, the know-how, the design. It's all available there. Plastics, LED displays, basic computer chips. It's all available in China.
And is that because of the connection, obviously from a geopolitical perspective, the location of China in relation to Vietnam, in relation to Taiwan, and, all the entire industrial hub that exists around that country?
No, I mean, it's because the Chinese government follows a path that had been blazed, though never at the scale that China did, by countries that had managed to industrialize and focus on manufacturing, export-led manufacturing. Of course, we're talking Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Then comes the next wave, the tiger economies, Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, to a lesser extent Indonesia, which happened later. And the Chinese government studies these successes in terms of lifting people out of poverty and building wealth, and understands, once the Chinese Communist Party starts embracing this reform path in beginning in the 70s, but really picking up speed into the 80s and the 90s, that ideology becomes peripheral to the mission of industrializing and building wealth. I mean, as Deng Xiaoping, who was the paramount leader of most import during the reform era, put it, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, just matters if it can catch mice. And that's the mantra as China sets about investing very heavily into infrastructure, courting foreign investment, engaging in serious industrial policy to build up industry to scale, and focusing on exports. It is the most successful anti-poverty program in the history of the world.
Yeah, for, obviously for its people, but then I think the negative implications, given the pressures from Wall Street on lowering costs, low prices for consumers, and then profits, actually also help to destabilize our labor workforce here in our country and across the globe.
Yeah, I mean, we did that to ourselves
To a certain extent, yeah.
I mean, the benefits of U.S. trade with China have been enormous. I mean, it really has been a consumer bonanza. A lot of wealth has been made in the United States, exporting goods and services to China, but importing a lot of increasingly high quality, cheap goods. What we failed to do was take care of the people who were in harm's way, the people who lost their jobs to low priced imports. And we failed to craft a deal that would protect us from the impacts of China's aggressive subsidies. I mean, government subsidies into industry, are the standards for workplace safety, for labor organizing were, minimal to non-existent. And that's how the Western multinational companies wanted it. They did not want to deal with labor unions. That's why they were going to China. But this is something that we've really done to ourselves more than, as the political narrative would have it, as if we've been victimized, by some sort of conspiracy from China. This is an inside job.
Yeah. Absolutely, I do agree with you. Talk about Henry Ford. You mentioned him a lot throughout the book. His philosophies on labor and paying fair wages, because he sort of foresaw the impact by not really taking care of people, how that can actually affect, again, this idea behind profits and success in being an industrialist.
Yeah, it's a really important point. A thing or two about supply chains. He knew an awful lot about how to assemble products at a mass scale and drive down the prices, and how to mobilize people and materials at enormous scale. He is the godfather of the modern supply chain. And I think it is really interesting that he doubled wages for his employees in 1914 at his factories in Michigan, and he did that in a way that caused a lot of unhappiness in the rest of the industrialized world. People called him a communist, and he said, "Look, I'm a capitalist. I'm just trying to make my goods at scale reliably, and I understand that if I want the full attention of my workers, if I want them doing their best work, laboring hard, bringing me fresh thinking." They can't be bothered by worries about not being able to pay their bills. I don't want them shopping around for other jobs after I've invested in training them. And that costs money. So I have a more resilient operation if I can pay people decently. And that's what he did. And that is something that we have very much lost track of, as increasingly the consulting class tends to describe the human beings who are critical to the supply chain. I mean, just any package that lands at your door, somebody drove it in a truck or hauled it in by rail or put it into an airplane by air freight, and people made it and guided the machines, and dock workers lifted containers, or they were there as they were guiding cranes, lifting containers on and off of ships. There's a lot of people we're invited to not think about. And during the worst disruptions of the pandemic, we were told time and again that, well, we ran out of truck drivers. That's why there were these big floating queues off of ports like LA and Long Beach, because we didn't have enough truck drivers to haul the containers off the docks. We didn't have enough people working in warehouses. We ran out of those people too. What we ran out of, if you actually look into it, as I did, is people willing to sign off on the bargain that has become driving a truck, a job that's always been hard, has always involved distance from family, being on the road a lot. It's tough to sit behind the wheel of a truck for 10, 12 hours a day, tough to sleep out on the road, but it used to pay really, truly middle-class wages. And now it's basically a working poor job. And so we have to get back. If we want reliability, we got to pay for it.
Yeah, you actually drove alongside a truck driver on a 3-day long haul. From where to where?
I
I was
did.
trying.
Yeah, I got
And
the
so
cab.
you're not just saying this because, as a theory that you came up with, while you're writing the book.
Oh
You
no, I've seen it.
actually got into that cab. I think his name was Graves. Was it
Stephen Graves.
Graves?
Yeah, who
Yes.
just retired actually.
Oh, good for him.
Yeah, good for him is right. Yeah, he's sitting at home in Tennessee now. Yeah, I'd heard all about the truck driver shortages, and then I did a little bit of research, talked to an expert who had written a book, actually a former truck driver himself, this guy Steve Viselli, who's a labor expert at University of Pennsylvania, and helped me understand that this industry has been short of truck drivers for decades. And it's constantly lobbying the state and federal authorities to subsidize training programs for more truck drivers, so there are more people, so we can keep this whole operation going, even though there's a lot of predatory scheming involved in this industry. They hook drivers in with the vision of seeing the open country, and then they're locked into they pay for their training programs, often at wildly inflated rates, And then the drivers have to sort of pay back their training by being committed to that one trucking company, come what may. They tout leasing arrangements where drivers buy their trucks at vastly inflated rates. They have to get their trucks serviced at service stations that are affiliated with the trucking companies at very expensive prices. And so I wanted to see for myself, what is this job exactly? So I got into the cab of a truck in Kansas City on a freezing cold day. It was like minus 14 in January of 2022. And I rode along with Stephen Graves for 3 days down through first Kansas and into Oklahoma and into Texas and down to Fort Worth, Texas, near the Dallas-Fort Worth airport to a warehouse. And then reversed the journey and made the journey back, slept in a bunk at the back of the cab for a couple of days and saw, man, this is not a job that you would do unless you didn't have a better way to pay your bills, because truck drivers are sitting there just fretting over how can they be caffeinated enough that they're not going to fall asleep at the wheel. As Stephen Graves put it to me, if you're not afraid out here, you're a fool. It takes the length of a football field plus to stop a 53-foot loaded up tractor trailer. And anybody who's been on the road knows there's all kinds of craziness out there, but they don't want to caffeinate so much that they're having to constantly pull over to use the restroom. They're worried about where to park. They're worried about where they're going to spend the night. Will they have to pay for parking? Will there be a space? Will they end up having to pull over on the side of the highway with security problems? This is a tough job. Like I say, it's always been a tough job. But before deregulation in the late 1970s, the Teamsters were in charge, another controversial institution, but an institution that demonstrates the power of having a union behind you trying to get your piece of the action. And there were plenty of truck drivers then because it was a good living.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the difference when you look at the labor supply chain. The dock walkers versus the dray operators. So the dock walkers are the guys who, again, correct me, if I'm wrong here, but the dock walkers are the guys who actually sit, in the cranes or manage the flow of the containers, taking the containers off the ship and onto the back of the truck. So those would be the dray operators, which if you just park your car off the highway around Long Beach, you can literally see the amount of work. And so the dock workers actually are unionized. And so they are almost considered kind of like the kingpins when it comes to this labor supply chain. And then you have the truck workers, that actually, the truck drivers who actually now have to drive from point A to point B to deliver the goods to the distribution facilities wherever they are. And that's not even to mention the railroad workers, which was really surprising to me that they don't even get paid sick leave.
Yeah.
And
Well,
for
some of them do now, but still not much. And at the time that I started the book, they had none of them. These traveling rail maintenance crews that are on the road for weeks at a time, driving thousands of miles from their homes. Yeah, they either, when they're sick, they either keep working or they don't get paid.
Right. And so, and you mentioned what happened with, I think, was it Norfolk Southern, with the capsizing of the rail trains that occurred. And, because
East Palestine, Ohio. Yeah.
from a maintenance perspective, because just as much as they drive the system, maybe not that one particular company, because I don't want to single out any one company, but it looks as though the system not only strains their workers, but also from a maintenance perspective, do the bare minimum to upkeep the capex that they've invested in.
I mean, the railroads that move freight in the United States are mostly duopolies. There's like two options, and in some places they're outright monopolies. There's only one option. And this is the outgrowth of deregulation that was driven by the interests of big box retailers, instead of prices that were posted and available to everyone, and a regulator who could mandate, which communities would be served. We've got, a free market, quote unquote, with the addition that, or rather the removal of any sort of transparency. So now you can have sweetheart deals between rail carriers and major players. And so this is really good for the big players. The big players get the benefits of their scale, and everybody else gets squeezed. And then you get shareholder maximization playing out in form known as precision scheduled railroading, which is like just in time on the rails. It's really, let's get rid of workers and make the workers who remain do more work than ever. Let's make workers more flexible than ever, which is a fancy way of saying you have to be on call virtually all the time, though you only get paid for the time that you're working. But, at a moment's notice, you could be told, too bad that it's your kid's birthday, that your spouse is having surgery, that you yourself need to go see a doctor. You are needed in some town 700 miles away. So get in a car and go. This is the system that we are relying on to move cargo around. And it's proven very vulnerable. It's been good for investors and not good for workers, and not good for the people who rely on the rail system, because, to your point about that East Palestine catastrophe, you got people working longer hours than ever. Morale is low, and trains are longer than ever, because precision scheduled railroading has involved reducing the number of trains while making the trains that are out there longer. So it's more complicated to manage the traffic. And when something goes wrong, as it did there, in that case, you had a brake malfunction that involved a part of the braking system that had been deregulated by the Obama and then the Trump administrations. The results can be really catastrophic. We had these huge fireballs and then a poisoning of waterways in that town. It was really an environmental disaster.
Yeah. It was just really mind-boggling. So continuing on this labor discussion, let's talk about the working poor, which is how you termed it, right?
Yeah.
The book was trying to, I guess, maybe quantify what this means. And you mentioned, beyond the social implications of this widening inequality, the scarcity assailing communities, the breakdown of faith in democratic institutions, taxpayers were footing the bill for the obliteration of labor power. You could see it in the ranks of those who depended on food stamps to feed their families. More than 9 million American families relied on the program at some point in 2018. And 75% of those families, it wasn't as though, they were unemployed. They actually were working.
Right.
So 75% of people who are on food stamps to feed their families have a job.
That's right. Yeah,
And
I think you're framing that just right. I mean, the takeaway there is that, contrary to, I think, the kind of fundamental values of, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm tempted to say most of us in this country, that, if you work hard, you set an alarm clock and you do your best to go off to work, then you should be guaranteed something, right? Like, you should be able to put food on the table for your family. You should be able to have some health care, the prospect of retirement in decent circumstances. You should have a roof over your head that is comfortable and safe. And I think most of us are steeped in this idea that if you are particularly innovative, you have some idea that nobody else had, and you turn that into a business, then you get the rewards. You do better than most people. I think we're all okay with that as capitalists in this country. But I think our basic sense of decency is, if you've got a job, you should be able to provide for yourself and your family. And that's just clearly not true. We have large numbers of people whose jobs have been downgraded to the point that we, the taxpayer, have to subsidize the ranks of fast food workers, warehouse workers. Those businesses can't operate, can't find enough people willing to show up and be fed without our taxpayer funds going in. I mean, that is an outrageous form of corporate welfare.
Yeah, because I actually did the research, because I was like, well, that was 2018. So then I went and I looked up at the, I guess, USDA website, as well as Pew Research. And that number from, what, you said, 9 million households, I believe, ended up being, as of 2023, 21.6 million households. So
Yeah.
that was just in 5 years alone. And I think this speaks to the problem at hand, is that there aren't no jobs. There's no such thing as a worker shortage. It's just that there's such terrible jobs. Right. And they don't pay well. And I know that a lot of states are now doing a lot to increase that minimum wage levels. Kudos to California for that. But I just feel like 141% increase over 5 years. There is a problem inherent in those numbers.
I mean that you put your finger on it. I mean, narrowly, for the purpose of my book, that's not a good way to feel confident that you'll be able to go to the store and find what you need, or come home and discover that the package you ordered is there. More broadly, and this veers into the subject of my last book, Davos Man: How the Billionaires Devoured the World. It's a pretty bad way to run a democracy, because if large numbers of people are working really hard and not earning enough to support themselves, there's a good chance that they're not very happy about it, and that they begin to lose faith in basic institutions. And they conclude, not without reason, that the people running the economy don't put a lot of importance on their ability to support their families. And we don't know how that goes, but it doesn't go well. It creates opportunities for politicians to then come in, diagnosing real problems like the breakdown of middle-class living standards, while prescribing, ridiculous solutions, demonizing immigrants, blaming countries on the other side of the Pacific for problems that are our own making at home. And it's part of why our political dialogue has been so poisonous. It's very hard to imagine, how you can deal with a pandemic, or, the largest crisis of all, climate change, if large numbers of people have noticed that their basic upkeep doesn't seem to matter very much to the people in charge.
Yeah, and also to the people that are, the recipient of those goods and services that are being delivered, right? Like, it's almost as though we as consumers, and I'll count myself in there, it's like our heads are stuck in the clouds. We want a t-shirt and we want it in 24 hours, or else all heads will roll. And that's not how it was, and I think by being so demanding, and this idea of consumerism, can lead, it actually has consequences to the people who are delivering this service. So let's fast forward to 2024 now, with the pace of automation, which I'm a big fan of, when it comes to reindustrialization, and really, okay, fine, we have this narrative. People don't want bad jobs. They want to be able to work, earn a good living. When you look at the average apartment rate in the US. I think it's like a little bit over $1,500 a month. And then I lived in New York for over a decade. So there was this thing in New York where you wanted to rent an apartment where it had to be 40 times the rent. Your gross income had to be 40 times the rent. And so if you take that $1,500, 40 times that, that technically should be for at least a technical skill set, whether that's a production manager, production worker, truck driver. I think it comes out to about roughly maybe $50,000, $60,000 a year. And most people who qualify for food stamps actually live below the median level. So now a lot of companies are saying, okay, fine, we can't find these workers. Let's go out there and get robots. Let's go out there and automate our factories. What are your thoughts around that? Because as much as I like that, I'm very concerned that it might even get worse in terms of the skill sets of the workers that we actually need on these factory floors and, to support the automation and cobots. Like, how are companies looking at this from your perspective?
Well, it's a very important question. I think, first of all, we should take a step back and understand that automation, robotics, AI, these things are inevitable. It's human nature, right? I mean, we're going to use our brains to figure out how to lessen our burdens, to take dangerous tasks and unpleasant tasks, and figure out how to put machines in harm's way instead of human beings. The question is, in what system are we deploying these technologies, and who's in control of determining who gets the benefits and who gets the risk? That's the all important factor. I often reflect on this trip that I took to a big mine in Sweden a few years ago, where truck drivers were being threatened with the loss of jobs because they were experimenting with self-driving trucks. And I went there as an American, imagining that, workers were going to be horrified by this and opposed. And what I learned was, everybody I talked to working at this mine said, "Oh yeah, we're fine with it. This is Sweden. There's very high taxes. There's very generous social services. There's national health care. College is affordable. If you have trouble with housing, there are programs. If you lose a job to trade or technology, there are very robust training programs, in contrast to what we have in the US, that are also very effective. And so everybody I talked to said, yeah, we're fine with it because this will make our company more profitable. And if the company's more profitable, we'll get higher wages. Again, lots of labor unions there, strong labor unions. So that was not some utopian fantasy. That was based on their lived experience. They understood the company is more productive, then indeed the wages get passed through these annual labor agreements to working people. Well, you contrast that with the US, where labor unions are weak. They've been cut down below 10% of the workforce, where we don't have national health care. We don't have robust training programs. And if you lose a job, it's a steep, quick way down. You can end up homeless, or at least, if you're lucky, if you lose a good factory job that's paying you $20 an hour or more, you'd be lucky to get a job in a warehouse that's paying you half of that. And so our own workers are legitimately looking at new forms of technology that, as from the beginning of capitalism, are often directed at lowering labor costs. I mean, the dock workers, as we speak, there's a potential dock worker strike on the East Coast of the United States and the Gulf of Mexico. Dock workers understand that container shipping, which has been a modern miracle and great for consumers and great for innovation, has been about replacing dock workers with fewer people, machines. And so American workers are not crazy when they say this stuff is about shrinking the human dimension in factories and warehouses and transportation networks, because let's face it, robots don't need bathroom breaks. They don't get pregnant. They don't get sick. They don't have kids waiting for them at home. They work whenever humans want them to work. And so, again, we're not going to stop that, nor should we try to. That there's a lot of benefit that comes out of automation, but we got to make sure that those benefits are shared in a way that's equitable and that creates new opportunities for all of us, and that the people who are displaced, and some people will inevitably be displaced, are positioned to then get something in the next iteration of the economy.
Right. And I think that's probably what a lot of European countries, not all of them, but most of them, in terms of robust training programs, we really don't have that here
Right. We've
in
underfunded.
America.
Yeah,
We don't. And even if we did, it would be okay, go to a 2-year college or a 4-year college that, you're going to get credits for subject matters that are not even being used in the workforce. And so how do we retool our education system? At least that's what it sounds like. How do we engage more people by paying them well and taking care of them? Because yes, maybe in the short term, it might impact costs, which are important, but in the long term, it actually increases profits and is beneficial for all. My question to you, because from reading your book, this is not about trying to point fingers, considering the political divide in our country. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. This is a United States of America issue, where we, as the next generation of industrialists, can make a difference. How would you encourage that new CEO who is building an electric vehicle factory, for example, or that CEO who is trying to implement AI into data analytics? Because when you began the call, you said from a PR perspective, you get a lot of outreach.
yeah,
People reach
right,
out to you, hey, I'm working on this app, I'm doing this software.
right.
Like, and you're like, okay, tell me something new. What would be the advice to those kind of founders, CEOs, and even some of the existing Fortune 500 companies that, maybe at the time they had to make a decision that really they didn't understand the implications, or maybe they did understand the implications, but they didn't really understand the negative aspect. How can we all work together to include the human connection for the future as we walk alongside technology?
Well, I think we need to make sure that we're not having the deployment of these technologies directed just by winning the next quarter. People running businesses, especially publicly traded companies, have this slavish devotion to whatever makes share prices go up in the immediate term, and they're radically opposed to anything that might dilute the next quarter's earnings, and that's just in opposition to running a vibrant company. That's a setup for depleting your resilience for the sake of sort of short-term sugar highs. I'll give you an example. Like during the worst of the pandemic, this is a story I tell in the book. We had rail companies that were intentionally hauling cargo to the wrong destinations on purpose because Wall Street was hungering for lower dwell time. That's this measure of how long cargo sits in any particular place. So I found this engineer working for Union Pacific out in Idaho who was horrified to discover that he was pulling cargo to the wrong place because some guy running the rail yard in Nebraska took this imperative to lower dwell time as an invitation to just attach as many cars as possible to the next train wherever it was going. So this engineer discovers, oh, I'm hauling auto parts that somebody's waiting for in California to Oregon because we've lowered dwell time. Well, that's good. That's a real strain to call it good. It's good if your objective is to lower a number on an Excel spreadsheet for dwell time because you think investors are going to send your stock price higher. That's a terrible way to run a railroad. It's a terrible way to serve your customers. It's a terrible way to serve your workers. And it's a direct outgrowth of this short-term thinking that we've got to be rid of. I also think, what's in my book is a warning that the supply chain, procurement, transportation, these are areas of businesses that are generally looked at as unsexy. You don't join a business so you can understand what's happening in the mailroom. You want to be in product, you want to be innovating, maybe you want to be in marketing, fashioning the story. Well, this stuff really matters. And back to Henry Ford, who you were asking about earlier, there was a conversation that Henry Ford had with Thomas Alva Edison, who he worshipped. I mean, Edison had already developed the light bulb, but they're riding in a rail car after this business event in New York on Coney Island. They're riding through Brooklyn toward Manhattan, and they really bonded over their shared dedication to what we would now call the supply chain. They're trading stories about their inability to get hold of the materials they need, and they realize that you can have the most brilliant ideas in the world, but if you don't have a reliable supply of what you need, whether it's raw materials or human beings who are motivated to do their jobs, you got a problem. And that's something that people running companies now need to embrace. They need to think about the risks to the sort of ruthless on paper form of efficiency that we've pursued, where we've been invited to pretend that, a factory in China might as well be the same as a factory in Michigan, as long as it's connected to some port, as long as the internet's there, as long as you got electricity. Well, that's just not true anymore. We need to focus on place and risks and resilience, or we will definitely be here again.
Yeah. I just want to read from your book this piece, which you talked about the journalist Barbara Herring.
Right? Yeah.
Okay. Once described the exertions of poorly paid employees as a universal subsidy that held down the cost of living for all. When someone works for less pay than they can live on, when, for example, they go hungry so that you can eat more cheaply and conveniently, then they have made a great sacrifice for you. They have made you a gift of some part of their abilities, their health, and their life. The working poor, as they are approvingly termed, are in fact the major philanthropists of our society. They neglect their own children so that the children of others will be cared for. They live in substandard housing so that other homes will be shiny and perfect. They endure privation so that inflation will be low and stock prices high. To be a member of the working poor is to be an anonymous donor, a nameless benefactor to everybody else. A functioning supply chain has come to depend on routine forms of exploitation, and these are false bargains. And everybody, I believe, who needs to read this book, not just CEOs. Peter S. Goodman.
Thank you.
I highlighted so much. I could not put this book down. It was riveting.
I'm so glad.
It was readable. Please, where can people follow you and follow your work?
I'm on all the usual places. Twitter, I'm still calling it that. Peter S. Goodman. LinkedIn, Peter S. Goodman. My website, petersgoodman.com. My New York Times author page. And I appreciate it. I appreciate your careful, thoughtful read and your terrific questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't wait for your next book to have you back. I think it would be fascinating. You have a really unique way of taking such a complex subject and putting it on paper that even somebody without a high school education can actually understand the intricacies inside the global supply chain. So
thank you for that. I really enjoyed this.
This was great. I know you have to run, but again, thank you. I'm sure the audience maybe will have comments once we post this on YouTube and also on all podcasts where we can on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and thank you so much.
Thank you again. Great to talk to you.
All right. Take
Okay.
care.
Take care.
Bye.